So the hypothesis is that God is an abstracted ideal, formulated in large part to dissociate the ideal from any particular incarnation or man or ruler. And the underlying idea there too is that when the ruler becomes the ideal, the state turns into the biblical Egypt. And the biblical Egypt is a tyranny. And so there's a very, very solid idea in the Old Testament that I think took people, God only knows how long to figure out, that if you confused the notion of sovereignty with the current sovereign, then your culture immediately degenerated into a totalitarian state and turned to stone. And that was deadly. Then you were slaves. And then the thing was going to collapse as well. Like, no matter how big and grandiose, as soon as the ruler became the concrete incarnation of the ideal, there was no distinction between the man and the divine notion of the ideal, then the society was doomed. And I think that that's I think that's true. It's as simple as that. And I think we saw more than enough evidence of that in the 20th century, and we're certainly seeing the same thing repeating itself now. When the ruler becomes the ideal, the state turns into the biblical Egypt, and the biblical Egypt is the archetypal tyranny. So, what is God like? Well, from the Christian perspective, there's three elements. One seems to have something to do with tradition. And so that's God the Father, and that's partly the embodiment, I would say, of the human being, and that's an ancient thing. And it's also partly the embodiment of the tradition of human beings, which is also a very ancient thing. And that's the structure, as I said. It's the structure that consciousness emerges from that enables us to grapple with the unknown as such. And then there's the intermediary between that and Christ, say, that's the Holy Spirit, that's that bird. And that's the Spirit in a more abstracted sense. And I would say that's probably as close as Christianity ever got to the notion of consciousness as such. Disembodied consciousness, something like that. And then there's the notion of the suffering individual, and that's a very complicated idea. And it's something like, so there's this idea, an old idea, and I believe this was originally a Jewish idea, that something with the attributes of God, omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence, lacks something. So it's like a Zen cone. It's a really interesting idea, because you think, well, what in the world can something like that lack? And the idea is limitation. So something that's everything lacks limitation. And that idea, like when I first encountered that, just blew me away. I thought it was such a brilliant realization that there are advantages to not being able to do things. Partly because it gives you something to do. I suppose that's a big part of it, right? If you had everything you wanted at every moment at your fingertips, well, there's nothing, there's no story. And it's funny, because that happened to Superman, the cartoon character. By the 1980s, he could juggle planets, and you could bounce like hydrogen bombs off him and it'd be fine. And it's like everyone got bored because, well, what were you going to do to Superman? It's like you lob a hydrogen bomb at him and he just brushes it off and like combs his hair, and that's the end of that. And the whole cartoon series basically died because he didn't have any flaws. There's no story without the limitation. And I think that's an absolutely remarkable idea. And so part of the notion of Christ, and this is something that I puzzled over for a long time, and I learned a lot of this from Jung, is that there's idea in Christianity that there's consciousness as such, which in some sense is eternal. It stretches from the beginning of the time to the end of time, but it's this abstracted notion. But it lacks a certain kind of reality because it's not instantiated somewhere. It's not instantiated in a specific time and place in history. And so the idea of the Son, the third part of the Trinity, or one of the three parts of the Trinity, is the notion that tradition and consciousness as such also has to be embedded in history in a particular time and place. And so there's the archetypal embeddedness, and that would be the incarnation, and that's the perfect man, right, who accepts his mortality and acts in a virtuous manner. But it's the archetypal story of every individual as well. And there's a very strong strain in Christianity. I would say this is more pronounced in Orthodox Christianity, that the proper path of life is to take the tradition, let's say, and the spirit that's associated with consciousness as such, and to act it out in your life in your own personal life in a manner that's analogous to the manner in which Christ acted it out in his life. And what that means in part is the acceptance of the tragic preconditions of existence. And so that's partly betrayal, right? Betrayal by friends and by family and by the state. And it's partly punishment for sins that you did not commit, as well as the ones you did commit, and sometimes that's just a relief, but you know, the arbitrary nature of justice, and also the fact of finitude. And the notion is that your duty, let's say, and the way to set things right in the cosmos is to accept that as a necessary precondition for being and to act virtuously despite that. And that's a very, very powerful idea as far as I'm concerned. And I'm also, you know, the world's a weird place, and I've seen some very strange things in my life. And one of the things that I've seen is that, you know, I've dealt with some people who were very, let's say, that they weren't on a good path. Let's put it that way. And one of the things that was really interesting about being around people like that, it was like almost like they were surrounded by a gravitational field of sorts. I'm speaking metaphorically, obviously. And their worldview was so warped and twisted that if you came within contact of them, you all of a sudden started to play a part in their drama. And it was almost inevitable. They would maneuver and manipulate and interpret in a way that made you into the villain in their story, no matter what it was that you wanted to do. And unless you've encountered something like that, and many of you probably have, you don't know how powerful a pull that is. And so it's certainly possible that someone can act in a like a gravitational object and bend things around them to fit their narrative, their unhappy and tragic narrative. But I've seen the opposite too, you know, where people who were aiming upward with the best of their ability, and because of that, they had a positive effect on the people around them, and that ordered things around them in profound ways. And I think it's an open question, the degree to which the cosmos would order itself around you properly if you got yourself together as much as you could get yourself together. I mean, we know that things can go very, very badly wrong if you do things very badly wrong. There's no doubt about that. But the converse is also true. If you start to sort yourself out properly and then you have a beneficial effect on your family, I mean, first of all, that's going to echo down the generations, but it also spreads out into the community. And we are networked together. You know, we're not associated linearly. We all affect each other. And so it's an open question, the degree to which acting out the notion the notion that being is good and the notion that you can accept its limitations and that you should still strive for virtue. It's an open question how profound effect that would have on the structure of reality if you really chose to act it out. And I've seen things, as I said, in my life that indicate that I do believe there's a metaphysical element to life as well as the rational, practical element. And I think there are times when those two things come together, and I've seen that happen. And so I don't think we know the limits of virtue. I don't think we know what true virtue could bring about if we aimed at it carefully and practically. And so the notion that there's something divine about the individual who accepts the conditions of existence and still strives for the good, I think that that's an idea that's very much worth paying attention to. And I think the fact that people have considered that idea for at least 2,000 years quite seriously is also an indication that there's at least something to be thought about in relationship to that. So that's kind of the Trinitarian idea.
If you like this video, please give this a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more content like it, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching, and have a beautiful day.